One of the things it said at the beginning of the movie was that it was inspired by this book. Sort of in the Hollywood parlance, what exactly does that mean? You know.
Well, everything that takes place in the movie was reported to me in one sense or another by either priests directly or by Matt Baglio, who wrote the book and interviewed priests and people who were possessed. So it's a conglomeration of facts that has been, obviously you've got to put it into a 120-minute piece of entertainment. So I had no, I didn't feel any sort of compromise in that I knew I was writing a movie. Why lawyers want to make these little phrases up like inspired by or whatever, that's a legal question. Gotcha.
Well, the interesting thing about this movie, I think, is that it seems kind of anachronistic for like the way horror movies are made now, which is that it could very easily have been this very sort of exaggerated, sort of fantastical kind of portrayal of a possession and exorcism. Obviously, you had like real experiences to draw upon, but how careful did you have to be? Not just to make sure that it wasn't totally sensationalized, but at the same time, it was actually like dramatically compelling for maybe a modern audience who is accustomed to seeing maybe a more muscular depiction of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I think our intention all along, all the filmmakers involved, was to make it an authentic portrayal of a priest, the priesthood, and exorcism, and people who are possessed or believe they're possessed. So that was our intention. And yes, as a screenwriter, it's challenging because you're very aware that you have to make an entertaining, you have to make a piece of entertainment. I think what's most intriguing almost about the film is the debate, though. It is the debate. It's, yes, there are frightening things that happen, and yes, there are dramatic things that happen, but I think what people come away from the film, I think from what people have told me after watching it is they're very intrigued by the debate, and it's I think that's what they continue. That's what's spoken about after the movie. In terms of sensationalistic material and how far we went with all that, I actually had to tone down a lot of the things that were reported by Matt to me. Either because he was writing the book in tandem to me writing the screenplay, which is also interesting for me as a screenwriter to be writing something that was it's a very organic process in that sense. That he was writing and reporting to me things, and I would be making changes as I was going, listening to these new, bits of information that he'd come across. But oftentimes I would have to err on the side of caution in terms of like trying to make this believable. I think we were more concerned with making it believable than making it, sensationalistic. So there are lots of things that were reported that we all looked at each other and said, we can't put that in. People will think we've made that up. When actually we hadn't made anything up, and a lot of the stuff we cut out was just truth.
Well, how important is accuracy as a screenwriter? I mean, you can be 100% faithful to true events, to whatever the thing is that you're trying to analyze, but that may not make the greatest movie. Like, is there a line that you have to draw just creatively?
As a screenwriter, your first obligation is to entertain, and if you're not doing that, then you're not going to interest people in what you're trying to tell them anyway. So, I always try and approach it from the perspective of entertainment. But, I think you can take the most. It depends. So that just comes down to storytelling, and if you're an all right storyteller, you can basically make anyone's day seem interesting to someone else if you kind of view it through certain lenses.
This film, in each scene, this main character, he's always sort of questioning, and I'm wondering, through the process of writing this story, if there was a sort of architecture that you were coming up with where you would write, well, we have a scene now where he is encountering someone who is being exorcised, what are all the questions that would be asked in that moment? Was because of the source material that you had, were those questions kind of already there, or did you kind of have to look at, sort of go outside each scene as you were writing it to create what turns out to be like a really fascinating sort of like landscape of his questions and challenges to the logic and the plausibility of what he's seeing?
Well, it's definitely constructed in a way that's dramatic. It's constructed in the first and second and third act, and that you do have an arc in your character, and that is all constructed. But I think that they're all things that Father Gary himself, not necessarily always Father Gary, but other priests that I also interviewed, or Matt interviewed, had gone through. So there were certain debates that they had with themselves and doubts that they had.
Mm-hmm.
That I was drawing it on, I was drawing upon real experiences, but I definitely had constructed it into a dramatic piece.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At the end of the movie, I was curious, did you ever figure out what happened to Xavier, that he was absent at the end? I mean, obviously it's needed for him to be gone at the end of this movie, but did you, because that is outside of like the focus of the main character, do you have to come up with like a reason that he would be unavailable to help them, particularly given the fact that they are in the Vatican and you could kind of throw a rock and find another priest, presumably, you know?
Well, actually, it's not that easy to find a priest who's an exorcist. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the point as well, is that often these priests these days, a lot of priests these days, and I was surprised to find out, actually don't even believe in the manifestation of evil in terms of like it appearing as the devil or as possession. They don't even believe it. So it's not that surprising that you'd go to the Vatican and possibly not find a priest who would exorcise someone or could exorcise someone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I kind of half jokingly asked the question, but like sort of in a larger sense, did you sort of construct this story dramatically as sort of for you, much less the audience, like as a convergence of circumstances, or some sort of divine providence that caused him to witness this accident, which caused him to go to Rome, which caused him to work for this person, and then that person be absent and him have to confront this sort of crisis? I mean, I think there's an interesting question that the audience can ask, but how did you sort of see it? Did you see it as there is a plan that has shaped and driven his life to this moment?
Well, as is pretty apparent in the book, which is based on Father Gary's real life, he does feel that there was a plan. He does feel that there was something that pushed him in one direction other than another, and that something had prepared him. I mean, Father Gary did work in a mortuary, and he found that like as formative as every other experience in his life that directed him towards what he did. So, and when Father Gary, because I had interviewed him, had said that, it certainly made it much clearer what the arc of the character was, and that it would be a convergence of events that would lead to his ultimate faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One of the things when we were talking to Anthony Hopkins earlier, he was talking about how he would come up with ideas of maybe lines of dialogue that were partially his own sort of questions and partially, an interpretation of the character that he thought would be interesting, an interesting color. Like, how many experiences have you had with actors who wanted to, to participate in that sort of writing process and contribute? And I'm not trying to ask about horror stories, but the idea that, you could have an actor who has interpreted a character that you've written radically differently than you maybe had conceived him.
It's always hair-raising when any actor comes up to you and says, I've been read the script and I've got some ideas. You're always a little bit like, I hope they're ideas that I can, agree with. And sometimes they're not, and sometimes you have writers who, you have actors who actually want to be writers, I think. Mm-hmm. I actually had the experience of one actor coming up to me and actually saying, I'm actually more of a writer than an actor. And it just didn't please me at all to hear that. It's like, but I think Tony brought, as he always does in his roles, and he brought us so much human humanism to his character and humour to the character, which I think he just teased out of what was there, but he did a great job, and because he was so interested in the subject matter, and he wasn't doing it for any egotistical reasons. He was purely doing it in terms of like arriving at a better understanding of his character. It all turned out for the best.
Mm-hmm. Well, as Tony and the other actors have said, they wouldn't necessarily be sitting around all the time thinking about the plausibility of exorcisms or demonic possession, but working on a movie like this, force them or encourage them to sort of contemplate that. As a result of making a movie like this, do you achieve any greater degree of certainty about your own questions about spirituality? Did you sort of already have a pretty firmly established sense of what you believe?
No, actually, I approached the material slightly skeptically, and also with a good amount of fear, because I didn't know how involved I wanted to get with the subject matter. Being invited to sit in on exorcisms is disconcerting, and I wasn't really sure if I wanted to do it, but I did. And actually it challenged my faith a good deal, because I didn't see anything in what I had observed that was... Well, I observed some very weird things, people talking in very strange voices, and things like that, and people writhing around on the floor, and obviously in a great deal of psychological discomfort. So it wasn't like it was at all laughable, or it was actually disturbing, but on a human level. But I came away, and I didn't witness anything, but I also had no reason to doubt these priests' story. I didn't see any reason for them to lie to me. If they were willing for me to see that, and they would often say to me, "Oh, that person isn't possessed. They just they're mentally unstable." So they would seem so pragmatic themselves in their approach to the material that I had no reason to doubt their other stories. Mm-hmm. And they would say, this doesn't happen all the time, or this happens very infrequently, and then they tell you this story which would make your jaw drop.